Hello, everyone. Welcome to this latest episode of Kontext Coffee Chat. I am Katja. I'm the founder of Kontext Coffee Company. We're a small specialty coffee roastery based just outside of Monmouth, here in the UK. And I have started this series of coffee conversations to talk to people from all over our supply chain to give you a wider context of where our coffee comes from, how it gets here, how it impacts people and the environment, how it's traded, and why all of this matters in the first place. I'm really excited to talk to Adri Yahdiyan from Ontosoroh Coffee for this episode. And we will be talking to him about what growing coffee in Indonesia is like. He should be joining us shortly, I hope. All right. We've got audio. Can you hear me? That's all right. We'll just do it like this, and maybe the video comes on at some point, or I don't know. That's all right. Technology, you know, you have to work with what comes at you.
Yeah, apologies for the technical difficulties. I don't know. Probably the signal is not great or whatever.
Thank you so much for joining in any case, even if we can't see you in person, but the audio is really great. So thank you for being here and thank you for talking to me today.
My pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
Good. I did a little introduction just before you joined, but maybe you can give us a quick, round of who you are and what you do, what your role is in coffee, and in our supply chain specifically.
Yep. Good afternoon, good evening, guys. My name is Adri. I'm the co-founder and managing director of Ontosoroh Coffee. We are a coffee exporting business based in Indonesia. Our role is we mainly be a facilitator of traceable and transparent coffee with our partners, between our partners and our buyers, including Katya, of course, and through our importer Decide Up. And we are partnering with right now 8 different origins in Indonesia, and particularly I assume the one that we were going to focus today, including Enrekang. So yeah.
Which is, I mean, for those of you who aren't as familiar with that part of the world, Indonesia is the largest island nation in the world, basically.
Yes.
And the 3 main islands, correct me if I'm wrong, Adri, Sulawesi, Java, and I'm blanking on the third one.
Yeah. So yeah, Sumatra is the other one. Yeah, Sumatra.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
All the technical difficulties have gotten to my brain. Yes, and we are buying this year and last year as well. We have bought a coffee from Sulawesi, from the Regency of Enrekang and the village of Karangan, through this side up, and Ontosoroh Coffee from the farmers of Karangan village. But that's not the only area in Indonesia that you're active in, Adri, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's correct. We are mainly focused on right now. It's in Java, Sulawesi, and Flores.
All right, and what's fairly unusual, I would think still, is that you deal in both specialty grade Arabica, but you are also a hunter of fine Robusta. Is that right?
That's true. I think it comes naturally because in Indonesia, 80% is actually Robusta. 80% of coffee production in Indonesia is Robusta, and the 20% is Arabica. So yeah, we have way more Robusta than Arabica, and yeah, it's natural to try to um, pick the best of both worlds.
I actually haven't asked you this before. Do you only source specialty grade coffee, or do you source and sell commercial grade coffee as well?
Only by request, not by, let's say, not by stocking.
Yeah.
Sometimes our buyer, requested, let's say, grade two coffee for, let's say, for commercial use, for
Mhm.
blends or for for capsule or and stuff like that. It's not, it's not really commercial. It's like grade two, grade three. So, but as long as the economics are fine between for farmers, it is equitable for farmers, and the price is also acceptable by our buyers. Yeah, I think we will try to do what we can to
Yeah.
facilitate both. Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe let's rewind a little bit and start by asking, because Indonesia is one of those origins, in my experience, that is massively underrated when it comes to coffee. I have had the most spectacular coffees from Indonesia, and yet there are so many people out there who probably never tried Indonesian coffee, which is a shame. And so maybe let's look back in history, and can you tell us a little bit about how coffee came to Indonesia in the first place?
Yeah. So before going back, I must say that right now, just for a general fact thing, Indonesia right now is the fourth largest producing country behind Brazil, Vietnam, and Colombia. But 80, as I said before, 80% of them are Robusta, and 20% of it is Arabica. Now, when you only factor in Arabica, we are not. I don't think we are top 10. I think it's like 11 or 12. So why Robusta actually? So coffee comes to Indonesia. There are two versions of it. The oral version, when we talk about the oral version of coffee coming to Indonesia, it started with Arab traders in the 16th century. So they brought coffee plants from Yemen, from the port of Mocha, and then brought it to Indonesia, from Sumatra and then Sulawesi and Java. And it also coincides with the rise of Islam in Indonesia. Um, yeah, that was, the oral version of it. There are not a lot of written history about it, but we do know that in contextual history, that the first, that coffee becomes mainstream, or at least becomes a commercial plantation in wide scale industry is from the 18th century through the Dutch colonialization that came from Indonesia. So they came first of all in Batavia, in Jakarta, what is now Jakarta. They tried to plant coffee there, and then it spread throughout Java, and then it spread to Sumatra and Sulawesi, and then Flores as well. So yeah, that was the first, let's say, big big bang of coffee introduction in Indonesia. At that time was fully Arabica because it came from Malabar. The variety comes from Malabar, India. Therefore, um, some places in Indonesia still call some call this Typica variety Malabar.
Ah.
Yeah, and they're still found in some places, especially in West Java.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've come across that and have wondered about that. That's an interesting fact because Malabar is usually associated with India, right? With coffee
Yes.
from Malabar in India. All right,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, there are some coffee. There are some places in Indonesia it's called Malabar, and the coffee there is called Malabar. So there's a connection over there that came from the 18th century. There was all it was all Malabar over there, and then it became one of the most sought after crop in the world that eventually exported to back to Europe through the Americas, and then came to Brazil as well, and then the Portuguese came over there to become overtake Indonesia. Unfortunately, between the 18th century and then the 20th century, starting in 1900s, there was a massive leaf rust disease that affected majority, I would say 80% of Indonesian coffee. And it made industrial plantation that was governed by the Dutch colonial becomes unproductive, and then dead, and then and then they decided to change every coffee in Indonesia that is planted below the 1100 meters above sea level to Robusta. And therefore now Indonesia is mostly known for, majority of the coffee comes from, majority of the coffee is Robusta.
Okay, and that's because Robusta is more resilient to coffee leaf rust?
Yes. Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. This is something to take note of because coffee leaf rust is, again, Adri, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a fungal disease that affects coffee plants. Some of the Arabica varieties are more prone to it than others, but it's a disease that's still around and that is still affecting some origins more than others. Right now and in the last few years, it has been a particularly big problem in some of the Central and South American coffee origins as well.
Yeah.
But what's the situation with coffee leaf rust in Indonesia today?
It is an issue, but it's not the main issue. In some parts of Indonesia, I mean, because whatever Arabica is left in Indonesia, it is planted above the threshold of 1200 above sea level. So it is a little bit more protected, I would say, by this fungus. However, there is also another invasive issue for coffee plantation, which is coffee borer. And these insects, this small insect that eats into the coffee seeds, and feed off the nutrition in the seeds, it's becoming an issue. Why is that? It's because global warming, where you wouldn't find it, let's say 15 years or 20 years ago. Now it's becoming a big issues in parts that the ecosystem climate is quite barren, or quite hot, quite humid, and one of the the areas that most affected by it is actually in Enrekang. Enrekang is Enrekang, one of the biggest issues that farmers face in Enrekang is coffee borer. Yeah.
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 Yeah, I think we'll get into that in a minute when we talk a little bit more about the challenges that coffee farmers in Enrekang face
Yeah.
at the moment. And you know, as everywhere, climate change is one of those challenges, and all the diseases that come with it. But I thought what's really interesting to note, and quite different in Indonesia than in other parts of the world where coffee is grown, is the fact that it seems, as you said, it's oral history, but it seems like coffee has arrived on your shores in two different ways and at two different times in history, basically, which is quite remarkable because that also means that most likely there are different genetic pools of plants in Indonesia, right? Which is quite crucial today, I would think, because the genetic diversity in coffee is causing all sorts of problems, especially in connection with climate change. So that's definitely something that would be interesting to look into in the future. We've talked about this briefly, haven't we?
Yes.
And I think, yeah, I think that's definitely something, because in most of the other regions, at least outside of East Africa, it's mostly one path that coffee took, and then it's a very small pool of plants that was handed from one origin to the next and has populated the coffee growing world as we know it today. Whereas in Indonesia, it seems there were two separate sources of coffee plants that came into the country and started the coffee cultivation there.
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest, let's say, because differentiation between Indonesian as an origin to other places is that the diversity of the variety of the coffee. You would find genetically, let's say, hybrids such as the modern hybrids such as the Abyssinia or the S795, but you also could find very old, 18th century bourbon variety in
and that's
Indonesia.
one
And
that the Dutch brought over during
exactly.
colonization.
Yeah, exactly. And then you'll find Hibrida de Timor that Portuguese came, that the Portuguese brought. You also find the Malabar, as I said before, the Typica. It's called Malabar or Ateng, or some people call it. And there are some, there are still some Typicas that we haven't identified yet on how this genetic tree came about. For example, in Sulawesi, in the place we also partnered with in Malino and in Enrekang, and it's also in Toraja as well. There are typicas that we haven't seen anywhere else. We don't know what it is. We just call it typica because we don't know. We haven't they haven't done so much. So yeah, it is. It's a very diverse world when we're talking about Indonesian coffee, and I think that is, in a way, an advantage, but also in a disadvantage in other ways. Yeah.
Specify a little bit for us. It's an advantage because you have the choice, and there's so much still to learn about coffee in Indonesia. But how can it be a disadvantage?
It's a disadvantage because between different origins in Indonesia, there are different knowledge about this variety. So therefore, the cross education between origins it's quite difficult. For example, if you find in a world where Indonesia also only have one type of variety, let's say in Katura, for example, if all Indonesian Arabicas is Katura, therefore farmers from Aceh, could speak to farmers in Enrekang,
Mhm.
and they could gather pool of data, research, and education to improve this variety. But since different origins have different variety of coffee, this cross-educational it's quite tricky, quite difficult.
More complex. Yeah.
More complex, exactly. Yeah. So therefore, in Indonesia, you find that the productivity of coffee isn't really high. In let's say in Brazil or in Colombia, 1 hectare of coffee could produce 1 ton or more of green bean, whereas in Indonesia it's probably only around 600 to 700 kilos per hectare.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons for that is that the diversity in coffee varieties hasn't been well cataloged or studied enough to be able to have the proper agricultural practices and knowledge to increase productivity.
Yeah, that's basically that's how I'm I think that is what is happening, it's it's you need a pool of resources to really
Mhm.
understand and to improve productivity. But right now, it's too many subjects in in too many
Yeah,
places. Yeah, yeah,
hard to transfer knowledge from one place to another.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I see. I see. What I found interesting when we had a brief chat last week, and I've been thinking about this ever since. You said with the likelihood of coffee coming over from the Yemen in the 16th century, it landed in which part of the country?
Yeah, so it first came to Aceh. Yeah, Aceh was the first to that, or historically, the Aceh
Mhm.
was the first place that
Yes.
came about with with Arab traders, and then it
Mhm.
came to in Sulawesi in the port of Makassar.
Mhm.
At that time, it was the kingdom was called Goa, and between the Arab traders, the years between Arab traders came and Dutch colonization, these local kingdoms essentially, were the first the first cultivation
Yeah,
efforts.
coffee growers. Yeah.
Coffee growers, exactly. Yeah, they're the first coffee growers that introduced coffee to Indonesia. Yeah.
Yeah. And because you said in our previous conversation that there are some regions in Indonesia where the coffee growers see the wider context of how they grow the coffee within nature, within their environment. And they basically made rules to preserve nature, the nature that they need to make the coffee plants thrive. Whereas in other regions, it's becoming increasingly difficult because there isn't the same relationship with the surrounding environment. And so things like monoculture, which we'll get to in a minute, I think, are becoming more of a problem. And that difference in attitude towards nature and towards embedding coffee cultivation within your surroundings, that is something that I found really interesting and that I've been meaning to ask you, is that related to the arrival of coffee through trade, so through traders from the Yemen who brought coffee into the country, and then basically the imposition of the cultivation of coffee through colonialization by the Dutch, or is that not the case? Is there that connection doesn't exist?
Yeah. So in Sulawesi, coffee from since the 18th century is a very prized crop. Um, um, the wealth generated from the coffee trade at that time was huge. I mean, we're talking about not, we're talking about really high commodity, very, very priced commodity in the same sense of spices to Europe. And so, and fetch a very big price at that time. Therefore, between these kingdoms in Sulawesi, um, it's it is becoming a trade. I would say a medieval trade wars, if I could say that. Therefore, the coffee plantations are highly regulated by the state, and therefore highly regulated in their cultivation culture. In places where the culture is embedded very deeply, rooted in history, let's say in Toraja, coffee is very well protected because they know it's a it's a very highly productive commodity. And until now, the effects of, um, the effect of this, let's say, protective protective culture, it's embedded in the modern cultivation culture. In places where I said before, Toraja, they still use traditional methods that was practiced, you know, hundreds of years ago, without any very much fertilizers, very traditional, very organic. But also there are other places in Sulawesi or in Java particularly, where the Dutch influence came about, and the effects of colonization is that coffee becomes an industrial commodity, not a special commodity, but an industrial commodity. And therefore, there are the practices that was introduced by the Dutch at that time, which is in the industrial farming, I would say green, quote unquote green revolution farming with a lot of industrial and chemical inputs is practiced, within the same in some areas where you really felt the colonization footprints there. And so there is, as you said before, there are two distinctive, coffee culture in Indonesia, and because of this difference in history of cultivation, yeah.
Interesting, definitely. Yeah, definitely something that's worth looking into some more, no?
Yeah.
On all sorts of different levels. I mean, from a genetic perspective, I think it would be really interesting to look into the different varieties and see, because of their different points in time of arrival in Indonesia, how they've developed in the meantime in terms of resistances and all of that. But also as a cultural anthropologist, I would be very interested to learn more about about how culture and the cultural perception of coffee as a cash crop, but also as a means of thriving in Indonesia, how that differs between the regions.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
And obviously it has an impact to this day, right? If we look at how coffee is grown today and how the differences come to play today, then maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that. I think we mentioned before the coffee that here at Kontext that we source through this site up in Holland as our importing partners and you as the exporter in that value chain is from Enrekang, Sulawesi. And the circumstances are a bit special, as we've discussed before. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what coffee cultivation looks like in Karangan village in Enrekang.
Yeah. So within after independence, Indonesian independence in 1945, in Sulawesi there are two major coffee producing regions. The first one is in Toraja. The second is Enrekang. So in Enrekang, there was quite of effort in the early years of independence in the 1950s to catch up with Toraja's production and quality, because they were the more prominent region in the area. So what you find is that through decades of effort in the 1980s, the coffee from Enrekang is quite well known in Indonesia as well as outside Indonesia. Most of us in Indonesia know this coffee by the term Kalosi. So Kalosi is quite well known coffee region in Indonesia. But then in the 1990s, after that boom in the 1980s, the 1990s coffee production started to decline. That coincides with the commoditization of coffee. Therefore, the price is going down and down. The price of coffee is it's depressed and going down very rapidly. Therefore, there was a decline. There was a decline in the 1990s, and people started to switch crops. And what people decided at that time, some families started to cultivate shallots as the means of as a cash crop. Now, shallots in Indonesia is quite, it's a quite cherished crop in Indonesia. Is much like garlic or much like and we use it in all sorts kind of Indonesian cuisines. It started, these innovators at that time acknowledged that shallots was quote unquote imported from Java at that time, and they found that there is a demand for shallot farming, and then they start to grow, and now it's becoming the main center of shallot farming in Sulawesi, and it provides the whole islands for shallots. And in Indonesian, in the whole Indonesian, Enrekang is ranked 4th as the largest shallot producing regions. Now, the unique thing about shallot farming is that it is quite the opposite of coffee farming. In shallot, you need really high, you really need ample sunlight. I mean, you need 12 hours of uninterrupted sunlight, and you need ample of water for daily watering, and you need ample of chemical inputs, because it's Enrekang is quite high. It's the lowest point in Enrekang is 900 meters above sea level, whereas shallots cultivation is actually more productive in the lowlands, in coastal areas, basically. But because of because there is a need, because there is
demand.
The demand over there, it just grows and grows and grows and grows, and unfortunately, it start to substitute coffee as the main source of production. cash crops for the farmers over there. And unfortunately as well, it encroaches in the forested areas in Enrekang. Therefore, the rate of deforestation in Enrekang is quite staggering. In the 1990s, at the start of the decade, Toraja and Enrekang roughly has the same amount of forested area, which is 40,000 hectares of forested area, whereas in Toraja now, today, to 2020, it still maintains roughly 38,000 hectares of forest, so only lost about 2,000 hectares. But in the same time frame, in Enrekang, they lost about 15,000 of forested areas due to deforestation.
Yeah.
So right now it's only around 28,000, 28 to 30,000 hectares of forested areas. So it's becoming.
And the main reason for that is shallot cultivation, or I mean, wood timber itself is an industry as well, isn't it?
Mainly rice and shallots. Yeah, I mean timber is everywhere. I mean the timber industry in Toraja. I mean the timber industry in Toraja is even bigger than in Enrekang, because in Toraja every traditional houses in Toraja uses wood, and they don't use any bricks or whatever. But statistic shows that the rate of deforestation in Enrekang is 5 times than the rate in Toraja. So it must be something else rather than timber. Rice, perhaps, also is also probably a big contributor of that. Also probably coffee in some areas also. We have to acknowledge that. But we think it's there are some studies that suggest shallot farming is one of the biggest contributor of deforestation in the area. Yeah.
Then maybe just for those of us who don't know as much about coffee cultivation and the agricultural necessities of how coffee is grown, you've described a little bit what happens with the shallot cultivation, and how does that contrast how coffee is grown in Enrekang, and where is the actual conflict there?
Sure. I mean, in coffee, to be able to grow coffee productively and within high quality, it needs to be protected by shade trees, and it needs to be protected by an ecosystem of agroforestry, basically. But in contrast to that, the shallot farming is in every single way is quite different. Coffee, you just need to put a shade trees, and then you could leave it alone, and then it will grow. And also it could grow for 30, 40 years and keep producing year on year without minimal inputs. But in shallots, you really need ample of sunlight, and you need very high density of water. Therefore, groundwater is extracted from the mountains that for shallot farming. Therefore, there's these two paradox. One needs to have a great agroforestry ecosystem to thrive, but let's say besides that, coffee plantation is a shallot farming plantation that needs
exactly the opposite.
very ample of spaces, ample of sunlight to go through to thrive. So you have these two different paradoxes cultivation needs, and it it's hard to reconcile these two requirements side by side, because it's very two different crops. But this crop, I mean, this crop came about because of demand and because of economics as well, and it alleviates when coffee prices in the 1990s was going really down. These are the crop that sustain livelihoods, you know. Until now, per hectare, a farmer that has a hectare of shallot farming could easily sustain a family of 6 or 8 or 2 families all year round. Whereas in coffee, for the same hectares, you really need to sell all the coffees that you have in that plantation as a specialty to get at least the same profit, and it's not even close, you know. So therefore, some coffee farmers are shallot farmers because they need to sustain their livelihoods, but they understand it's two different crops that needs two very different ecological needs to thrive. And it's quite the contradiction that for me myself as a student of agriculture, it's very hard to reconcile to find the balance between these two crops. It's quite difficult, but coming, it's not easy to choose one or the other because it's deep rooted in history.
So if we zoom in on Karangan as one example of a place where these two seemingly oppositional crops are grown in one place, can you describe a little bit how the farmers of Karangan village deal with these contradictions, and how, because the coffee that we've bought from there is uncertified organic, right? It's organic by default, because in their way of cultivating coffee, they don't use, as you said, they don't need to use any chemical inputs, any fertilizers or pesticides or things like that, because as long as the coffee plants have shade trees and have a healthy ecosystem, they thrive on their own. But you have mentioned that at least some of the farms cultivate both shallots and coffee, right? Can you tell us a little bit about how they juggle that situation?
That's true. However, I have to say, like coffee farmers in Karangan, a majority of coffee farmers in Karangan is also shallot farmers. That is clear. However, we have to look it in terms of economics. In terms of economics, I mean, the cost to grow year on year, organic by default, growing coffee organically by default in Karangan is not by design, but it's just by choice, because what you get by, let's say, what you get by, let's say, purchasing chemical fertilizers, it's not worth the cost, because the price of the coffee is not, it's not worth it to have any chemical inputs. So they just left it as it is, for generations. So the coffee that was grown in Karangan is mainly as a result of revitalization efforts in the early 2000s, and by the government. But since the early 2000s, they grow with minimal let's say inputs, but also very minimal maintenance. because the efforts of doing doing this is not the it's not worth the effort. So what they do is just they leave it alone, and when it's time to harvest, they pick the cherries. Most of them use a stripe, you know, and special, stripe picking. But some of them now starting to selective picking with red cherries. When it's time to harvest coffee, they harvest coffee, but afterwards they came to coffee. So coffee within 12 months, coffee usually harvested for 4 months, between the months of May to September. And outside those months, they came back to cultivate shallots. So that's how they sustain their livelihoods year on year. Yeah. So, but as I said before, as you said before, one farm could have coffee and shallots side by side, whereas in coffee cultivation they did just nothing, basically. But beside that, coffee plantation is a shallot farming plantation that needs really high chemical fertilizers. So although it's organically by default, yes, but you understand that some inputs will, let's say, spill over into the surrounding. Yeah, spill over into the surrounding coffee. Yeah.
Because it is the same ecosystem essentially.
Yeah, the same ecosystem. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it is what it is. I mean,
but it is, as you said before. I mean, I think on the consuming end of our value chain, we would like to think there are simple solutions. Organic is better, and so why don't they just grow everything organically? But I mean, more than anything, the motivation to do anything for us, as well as for farmers all over the world, is to make a living, right?
Yes.
And if they can't make a living of growing coffee alone because of the massive price up and downs and the volatility in the coffee market, they have to find a different solution to sustain their livelihood.
Yeah.
And so in Enrekang, that was shallots. That's just the reality of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it doesn't stop there, though, because you did tell me that there are plans and there's an initiative to look into this seemingly oppositional situation and do some academic research on how this situation can be optimized on all levels, on the economic level, on the social level, and on the environmental level.
Yeah. So so from when we started in Enrekang, we understood the problem, but there is no simple solution to it because there is a lack of research and lack of data that we could work with. Therefore, when we contacted Leonard, Decide Up, from Decide Up, our importer, we discussed this topic in depth and how this this very opposite in industry came about. And we think it will be a great idea to start a research project with our producing partner, which is Toduri Coffee, by the way, by Yolan. And starting
earlier, I think he joined us listening to it as well. Hi.
Hi, Yolan, if you were there. So yeah, Yolan. So Yolan is a great partner of ours. He is a new generational farmer in Enrekang that try try to solve this, economics issue by introducing specialty coffee, Enrekang specialty coffee to buyers, therefore fetching a higher price than they would have been otherwise. And at least this effort is, it's trying to bridging the economic gap between coffee and shallots, closing the economic gap. So therefore, there is a little bit more incentive for farmers to keep their coffee plantation a little bit longer, a little bit longer than than shallots. So yeah, together with him and with Leonard and Decide Up, we are trying to find this how call it a trade-off.
Right?
Yeah. Sorry?
The compromise between the cultivation of these two crops.
The compromise to really to produce, at least to produce the best possible potential for coffee and shallots within a given ecosystem. We are looking at, let's say, modern regenerative farming methods that we are looking into. We're also looking at studying a specific kind of agroforestry. I mean, what type of crop that could sustain both. That will be both beneficial and stuff like that. So yeah, so this is the short and long-term efforts that we are trying in Enrekang. So the short term will be, enticing farmers to produce specialty coffee to fetch a higher price. So there's more economic incentives. But also in longer term, we would like to work with farmers in the ground on how we could sustain both crops, side by side, and make the best of both worlds, basically. Yeah. So it's an interesting endeavor, and we thank Kontext Coffee for supporting this. And
in a very small way, but yeah. Yeah, I think, I'll definitely come back to you at some point to get an update on the situation, because I think this is one example of the complications that coffee cultivation is facing today, right? It's a very specific, very local set of issues, but I think it is representative of coffee cultivation in the sense that in a changing world, also changing due to climate change, coffee will come up against this type of challenge where you really have to look for local solutions in your implementation, but hopefully there will be overarching takeaways in the kind of data you collect and the lesson that you learn in looking into this that will help to implement similar solutions in different settings where coffee is grown next to other crops that might have very different requirements. And yeah, with climate change putting pressure on coffee farmers to change the way they do things, I think projects like yours are crucial in preserving the future for coffee in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's a collective effort. We cannot do it alone. And I would like to invite all of you that is watching this live. Also, if you have any ideas on or case studies that we could, that could help us in formulating a feasible plan, please feel we are more than welcome to to have that. So yeah, I mean, it's great also that this type of reaction with you, Katya, it's also bringing about these topics, and not many people would know the problem, but they don't necessarily, think that it will be, this challenging. Yes.
I thank you for sharing this as well, because this is one of the reasons why I started this series of conversations. These types of problems, they are more prominent and more well known on the producing end of the coffee value chain, but the people who actually enjoy and drink these coffees, a lot of times they have absolutely no idea that that this would be issues that would have to be considered in cultivating coffee in the first place. Because coffee isn't grown in the northern hemisphere; it's grown in the southern hemisphere of the planet, or around the equator, anyways. And so there is definitely a disconnect. I think it's important to shine light on that. Also, to emphasize that specialty coffee isn't just more expensive than supermarket coffee.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's fancy packaging, or we put tasting notes on the label, or things like that, right? There are actually, in many cases, there are projects on the other end of the value chain that are worth supporting through paying a higher price, so that farmers have an incentive to keep growing coffee for us to enjoy on this end, right? Because otherwise, why would they? If shallots are that much more productive and fetch better prices, then I think it's absolutely understandable that people who need to make a living and feed their families would consider choosing this crop over another, which happens to be coffee.
Yes, I mean, exactly. I mean, it's a whole, it's a whole sets of issues. I mean, it's great that we are now in a world of, I would say, responsible responsible consumption, or what you call, so people really understand what they are drinking, where does it come from, what they are eating, what they are drinking. So where did it come from? It's I think this is a crucial, it's a crucial movement that we need to keep moving towards. I mean, to be able to care what the conditions are in the ground where coffee or rice or anything that comes from or shallots, to be able to understand the challenges that they're facing in the ground. It makes you, at least make you think, and by doing that, we us in, from us in the origin countries, we will have library of knowledge, library of ideas that will help us eventually to, to make better, better plans for the future, for the profit for the farmers, but also the people, but also the coffee itself, the planet itself. So the environment, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's encouraging, and more than anything, we encourage all of you, let's say, Kontext Coffee customers, to really give us ideas. That's what we really would want, and to start a conversation. But not only a conversation, but we welcome great ideas, and this will help us, in many ways, in so many ways,
And in that spirit, if there are any questions for Adri, please feel free to ask. This is the time. We're closing in on an hour for our Kontext coffee chat. And again, it felt like 10 minutes because the conversation is so interesting, and there is so much more to say as well, right? But I'm sure that Adri, we will come back at some point and try and get an update from you on how things are going on the ground and how the reconciliation between coffee growing and shallot growing, how that's working out in Enrekang, in Caraga.
We hope so. I mean, hopefully you will be with us in the next 10 years, so we will give.
I hope so, yes. I mean, the coffee is absolutely spectacular. I have to say, we bought it last year.
Yeah.
And last year it was a special process.
Oh yeah.
It was a type of honey process that you implemented there, and it was already really, really nice. And this year we bought a washed lot, fully washed, and I have to say I keep going back to it because it's such a delicious coffee. I had it this morning on the cupping table, and then I made a filter version of it, and then I had to try it as espresso as well because it's just so nice. So yeah, keep up the good work, and definitely make sure the farmers have enough reason to keep growing coffee because it is delicious, and I will try my best to explain to people why it's worth paying a little bit more for it, so the farmers actually have the economic incentive to make profit from it and make a living from it as well.
Yeah, I mean, it will be. I mean, it is our honor that the coffee that we help to promote, it's being loved and being cherished over there, but in other ways, we are only a facilitator of, we are only a facilitator of trade, and the big heroes are the farmers. Yolan and his colleagues, farmer colleagues, are the real heroes of this, and they are doing a fantastic job. And it's I'm sure that they will be very happy what you guys have told me, and I will make sure to pass it along. And
Yes, please.
yeah,
and to all of you out there, give them a follow as well. They are on social media, Toduri Coffee.
Yeah.
I've linked them in the post as well. Tag them. So yeah, give them and Adri as well with Ontosoroh Coffee. Make sure to give them a follow and keep up to date with their progress and their efforts, because it's just really interesting to see where coffee comes from, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's great. it's nice to.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking to me, Adri. I really, really appreciate your time and your explanations about everything.
Yeah.
Do pass along our appreciation to the farmers of Caraga, to Yolan, and everyone who's involved in making this beautiful coffee. And as I said, I will do my best. We'll do our best to promote Indonesian coffee because it's absolutely spectacular.
Great. I mean, thank you so much. Grateful for the opportunity, and I hope to speak, in this context again.
Yeah, thank you. Great. All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and see you all soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.